By the time you finish watching this video, you'll have a good idea and a good understanding of what supplies you'll need. If you want to write something down, simply hit the stop icon. There are a multitude of supplies on the market, and I'll explain what works the best for me. Your local art supply dealer can be very helpful, especially if you ask the right questions. If they don't carry something that I suggest, they can recommend something that will work quite well. So, as starting out in watercolor, you're about to embark on something that can enrich your life and feed your soul. So let's get started. Watercolor paper. First, make sure it is marked for watercolor and not just drawing. Watercolor paper has sizing on it, which allows the paint to set on the paper briefly before it starts soaking in. This means you can move it around a little bit, which you can't really do on drawing paper. I prefer Fabriano, Jack Richardson, Sennelier, Winsor Newton. Those are all wonderful watercolor papers. The ones I use the most are Fabriano and Jack Richardson. Cotman also makes nice watercolor paper, and it works very well, particularly for classroom exercises. There's also a new to me anyway, watercolor paper on the market called Fluid. That one's a little bit less expensive than some of the more expensive papers, but it works great. And I'll be showing you some examples of that. Now, what you should look for, it should be marked 100% rag, and it should be pH balanced. That just means the watercolor paper is a higher quality and it's going to work better. Watercolor paper comes in different finishes. There's a smooth finish, which is called hot press. There's a finish with some texture in it, which is called cold press. And then there's a finish called rough, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's a rougher paper. I prefer cold press, and the other two are a little bit harder to work on. And so you should save those until you've been painting for a while. So start with cold press paper, avoid hot press and rough in the beginning at least. Watercolor paper comes in different weights. 90 pound is a lighter weight, and it will buckle quite a bit when you're working on it. 140 pound works well. That's what most watercolor paintings are done on. It buckles less and is beautiful paper to work on. There's also 300 pound paper, which is heavier, thicker, doesn't buckle as much, and sometimes I use that on a bigger painting. It's also more expensive and certainly not necessary for normal size watercolor paintings. The weight of the paper refers to what a ream of it weighs before they chop it into pieces. So if it says 140 pound watercolor paper, that means a whole ream of it weighed 140 pound before they chopped it into pieces. Less expensive papers are harder to work on, so this is not where you should try to save money. It'll just be frustrating. Try the ones that I recommend. Just to summarize on papers, I prefer cold press, 140 pound paper by Fabriano, Jack Richardson, or Cotman. If you use those papers, you'll be very happy with the results. Watercolor paper comes in sheets, blocks, sketchbooks, tablets, and rolls. I recommend using blocks. It's a little bit more expensive, but each of the papers is stretched, so you don't have to worry about doing that, and it won't buckle nearly as much, if at all. This is an example of a block, and this is that fluid watercolor paper that I mentioned earlier. There's usually a cover sheet like that, then the paper like this, and this is sealed on two sides. So after I finish a painting, I just go in here with a knife like this, and you want to use, I'm using a palette knife. Go along the edge like that and Same way down here where it's sealed. A palette knife is a great tool to use because if you use a sharp knife like an X-Acto blade or a box cutter, you'll end up cutting the paper. So you want something with an edge on it like that, but not really sharp. Typically blocks are sealed on 4 sides all the way around, in which case there will be an opening somewhere, either on one of the edges or on the corner, where you can slip in the knife blade, and just be careful going around so that you don't tear the paper. But with a block, each page is stretched like that. If you buy sheets, for example, then you can cut those into pieces, whatever size piece you want, and then you have to tape those down on either masonite or a drawing board. You can even use a piece of cardboard. But that way they're sort of semi-stretched and easier to work on. The supplies I recommend are for studio or classroom painting, and I use a slightly different set of supplies when I'm painting outside on location. And you can see that on some of the other videos. Now let's talk about the paints. I use Winsor Newton watercolor paints and Holbeins exclusively. They're the most expensive, but also the nicest to work with. The colors that I recommend are from both Winsor Newton and Holbein, but if you'd like to save some money when you're starting out, you can use Van Gogh watercolor paints. Those work really well and they're less expensive. Also, Cotman makes a nice range of colors. After you've painted for a while, you'll realize the importance of using the best paints you can get, but you don't necessarily have to start with those. I use a set of colors anywhere from 16 to 24, and I'll go through those, but to begin with, I'm going to give you a range of colors that'll work really well. There's not as many in there, and that's what you should start with. I try new colors from time to time as they come on the market, and some of them I add to my palette. But if you start with too many colors, it'll be confusing and it'll slow your progress. These are the colors that I recommend you start with, and actually it's a fairly large number. It's 14, but I have reasons for each of those, and I'll discuss them as we go. Starting with red, this is cadmium red. It's a nice warm red. It's a little bit opaque. The second red is alizarin crimson. It is a cooler red. It has some violet mixed in with it. So we have a warm red, cadmium red, and a cool red, alizarin crimson. Next is yellow. I have cadmium yellow, which is a nice hot yellow, and then lemon yellow, which is a cooler yellow. So I have a warm and cool yellow. The next color is yellow ochre, and that is simply a grayed yellow. It's yellow with a little bit of gray in it. Then we go into the earth tones. There's burnt sienna, which is a wonderful, very warm brown, has a lot of red in it. Then raw umber, which is a cooler brown. And then burnt umber, which is back to being warmer again, but a much darker brown. So I have it on there mainly because it's a nice, rich, dark color. Then for greens, I just have one green on this set of colors, and that is olive green. And I prefer that by Winsor Newton, but different companies make it. It's a nice kind of a neutral green, wonderful for landscape painting. And I mix most of the greens, so that's the only one I have on my palette. As far as blue, cerulean blue is the first one. It's a lighter, cooler blue. Then cobalt blue, which is kind of a neutral blue, and ultramarine blue, which is a warmer, deeper blue. So there's 3 blues: cerulean blue, which is cool, cobalt blue, which is more neutral, and ultramarine blue, which is a darker, warmer blue. And last is violets. You can mix all the violets you want, but there are 2 in tubes that I really like, cobalt violet, which is a lighter violet, and mineral violet, which is a darker violet. And those I use mainly because of their values, one light and one dark. Those are the colors that I prefer, and there are a lot of other colors on the market. But the more you use, the more confusing it's going to be to start out. Now, some artists like to use only, say, 6 colors. But if you do that, you do a lot more mixing, which I don't like in watercolor. It dulls the color every time you start mixing. So in oil painting, it works quite well to use fewer colors, but in watercolor, I like to have a bigger range like this. And these 14 colors will serve you well, and the more you learn about each one of them, the better painter you will be. Now you can add colors later as you get used to these. You might want to add another color like Perylene green or something like that. But get used to these colors first before you start adding other colors. Brushes come in synthetic and natural hair. The best ones are Kolinsky Sable. That's what this is. And the hair is from the tip of the Kolinsky Sable mink's tail. So they have to be taken out of the mink's tail and put back in the brush in the same order so that they come to a natural point and the hairs don't have to be trimmed or cut. And when this is wet, it comes to a really fine point. That's a number 10. The brushes also come in synthetic. And if you're starting out in watercolor, I recommend you use synthetic brushes because they work well and they take a lot of abuse and they're far less expensive. A synthetic or a Kolinsky Sable brush like this one can be very expensive, and it's not what you want to start with unless you have an endless supply of money. So start with synthetic brushes, and after you've painted for a while, then treat yourself to a nice sable brush like this one. This is called a rigger, and it's long, narrow hair, and it was originally for sign painters so that they could do graphics without constantly going back for more water and paint. It's nice for detail work. I like it a lot better than little small brushes, and it's fun to learn how to use. Like I said before, these are round. They're called round brushes in that shape. This is a half round, and this one is a natural hair. This one is, I believe, ox hair. They also come in squirrel. This is what they call a flat brush or chiseled brush. It has a flat end on it. I don't use those very often, but a lot of watercolorists love those. This is a brush I use for bigger washes. It's a 1.5 inch flat. It's synthetic hair, and it works really well. You can see from the handle how long I've had it and how much I've used it, and it's still working just fine. So the brushes I recommend, the ones I'd like to see you have to start with, are a number 10 round. This one is a number 6 or 7. This is a rigger, also known as a script, and this flat brush. And the flat brush is 1.5 inches, and it's synthetic. If you have these 4 brushes, you'll be able to do anything that I talk about in these videos, and they will serve you well, and there's no sense buying a whole bunch of brushes when just a few like this will work for you. The next piece of equipment is palettes, and I've used a large assortment of palettes over the years, and my first recommendation is that you get one with a lid. Like this one closes up, has a lid on it. This one has a lid that snaps on it. The reason is, when you're done painting, you go through, clean up your palette, get all the paint and water off of it. If there's any water like this in any of the colors, you have to dab that out. Let it set for a few minutes so it's good and dry, and then close the lid up. And when you do that, when you're ready to paint again, all you have to do is take the lid off, spray it with a spray bottle, and the paints are ready to go again. If you don't have a lid, then the paints dry out too much, and it'll be pretty expensive to do it that way. So make sure your palette has a lid on it like this, or a lid like this, and it should have fairly large mixing area, which this one does, and at 16 or more wells. 14 to 16 is good. My studio palette has more colors and more wells in it, and the one I use for outside painting is a smaller palette like this one. Has a thumb hole so you can hold it up next to the painting. This one I think has either 14 or 16 wells in it. Wells are just these little compartments here that you put the paint in. Now, if you're going to put your thumb through the thumb hole like this, it actually works better if you're an oil painter, because with watercolor, if it gets wet, it can run right down your thumb, down your wrist, into your sleeve, and get pretty messy. So I always just leave that closed like this. If I want to hold it next to the painting, I put my hand under it like that. Now, this is a metal palette with porcelain fused on it, and this one is a plastic palette. The plastic palettes are a lot less expensive and they work great. That's what you should start with. This one was considerably more expensive because it has enamel fused on it and it's a nice mixing area, but the plastic ones worked really nicely. Now with a brand new palette, when you first start mixing water and paint on it, it may bead up a little bit. That's because typically they come from the manufacturer with some kind of a coating on it. You can wash that off, or it will eventually just wear off fairly quickly as you use the palette. Some other supplies that you will need. This is a spray bottle. I have a much smaller one for when I'm traveling, but that's handy not only to moisten the colors, but also to clean up your palette when you're done painting. You'll need a water container. This is one I use for my studio. I have a smaller one for when I'm traveling. Just something with a big opening on top that holds plenty of water. This one actually has some ribs on the bottom for cleaning your brushes. You'll also need tissues or paper towels. I prefer tissues because I can do different things with them, and I prefer them for cleanup also. But if you're going to use tissues, make sure that they do not have lotion on them. It's harder and harder to find tissues without lotion on them, but the ones with lotion will just mess up your colors, cause them to bead, things like that. And if you're trying to blot out some of the color, you don't want that lotion on your painting. For pencils, for drawing, I use a number 2 or a number 2B or a drafting pencil. And I carry a little pocket pencil sharpener with me when I'm traveling, and I have an electric pencil sharpener for here in the studio. Another thing you'll need is a kneaded eraser, and that's what this is, and it's called a kneaded eraser just because you can knead it like bread dough. And when it gets dirty, you just work it like this until it cleans itself up again. But the reason you want a kneaded eraser, it does less damage to the watercolor paper. A regular eraser on a pencil can damage the paper more, and you can blot with this thing also and just lift up the pencil work with it. So a kneaded eraser is something that's valuable to have. A small palette knife like this one. I always carry with me because I paint on watercolor blocks, and to lift each paper off you have to slip it in and then go around the edge, and these are really handy for that. They're also handy if I want to scratch something out in the painting. Another item is a drawing board. If you're using sheets of watercolor paper or watercolor sheets that have been cut into smaller pieces, then you need to tape them down. So you'll need a drawing board for that and some masking tape. Your local art supply store can be very helpful. If you can't find any of the supplies that I've talked about, then talk to the people at your art supply store and they can recommend something that will work just as well. Every store can't carry every single item. These supplies will get you started, but remember, you have to use them. After you get your supplies, I suggest you watch my video on getting started. So this is Dennis Pendleton saying until next time, keep on painting.